I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of the Top 10 of the 2010s. And this week, we're going to be starting once again a new genre. In this 3 weeks, we're going to be talking about are the top 10 westerns of the decade. But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is talk about some of my favorite movies of the decade. Essentially, how the series works is every 3 weeks, I start a new genre and give my top 10 of said genre. I always upload on Mondays at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, and if you're curious about just hearing thoughts about some of the movies and not some of the other movies, check the description where I have timestamps and you can jump around and see what topics you want to hear. That's always very useful to a lot of people. But without further ado, let's jump into the episode. But actually first, I want to talk about it. Normally I do my honorable mentions and my 10 to 7 picks, and this is always a longer episode, but I feel like it's important at the top here just to talk about quickly what I think classifies as a Western, because some of the other genres, are very easy to understand what a comedy movie is, what a action movie is. But for the Western, especially because of how it's evolved over the years of cinema, it's changed to something completely different. So I like to explain just a little bit of the history of the genre and how that'll affect the movies that I'm going to be talking about in the future, and just to give you a brief definition of what I consider as a Western. So in general, the broad term and the broad classification is movies that are set in the second half of the 19th century after the United States Civil War, usually in the western part of the United States. There is a sense of lawlessness, a sense of sort of threat from the civilized, more rules and law-based East that are going to come over and take over the West. But as right now, the western part of the United States is still lawlessness, and there's always themes in these movies of crime and of justice, and oftentimes there's a cowboy figure, an outlaw figure who is kind of living outside the rule of law, and then there's another sheriff's character, for example, who's obsessed with the rules of law, or a lawyer figure who's obsessed with the rules of law, and there's always that sort of clash in that battle. Oftentimes, especially early on, there was a sense of heroism and a romanticization of this sort of lawlessness kind of an area in early America, unbound by the rules of today. They're at their peak in American movies of the 50s. We had this sort of the silent westerns, but really I think in the 50s with Rio Bravo and The Searchers and High Noon, we had sort of the peak of the Western, and we had stars like John Wayne, who was one of the biggest stars at his time and one of the biggest movie stars of all time, and he primarily did, of course, Westerns, and was involved with a lot of these successful Westerns in the 50s, and they had a very much traditional, almost superhero-esque heroism to them, and a sense of duty and of rights, but it's still sort of a mystery to the character itself. Then in the 60s, we had the spaghetti western, which introduces stars like Clint Eastwood, where they were made for cheaper. They're a little bit more of a B movie element, made in Italy, and had some different elements, and then that became sort of the gold standard at a time. And then once the new Hollywood was issued and entered in with the young filmmakers of the 70s, the western was sort of seen as the old Hollywood, and they didn't want to make westerns. They were much more interested in social realist movies that maybe reflected their times in the 70s, and wanted to make more modern films. So unfortunately, the western sort of got left behind in the 70s and 80s, but it didn't return and revive until really Clint Eastwood made Unforgiven in 1992, which used the audience's preconceived notions to reflect on what the Western was actually like, often referred to as the revisionist Western. This is a Western that actually tries to look at it from an honest perspective. Instead of having these cowboys seen as these heroic figures that always do good, it's more along the lines of what these people would have actually been like, which are more anti-heroes, murdering psychopaths. The life that they lived was such a hard and brutal life that these men and women went through, sort of turned them into a different type of person, and maybe not the heroic ideal that we always thought it was, but actually something a little bit more realistic. And that's where we sort of are today, that every single Western now pretty much is not the heroic Western. It is the very much reflection, gritty, realistic, revisionist Western. Now, I would also argue that in the 2010s and late 2000s, we got introduced to the neo-Western, which is just the idea of keeping the themes of the Western and then sort of transplanting them in another time period, or in just a different area, but still having a lot of those themes or a lot of the landscapes and looking at the past is often a theme, the impending future, but also reflecting on the past. So in this decade, I'm thinking of movies like Logan or Hell or High Water, which aren't set during this time, but have these similar elements that, we'll be discussing, I'm sure, with the later movies. But that's a certain type of movie that I actually saw more commonly in the 2010s, and I think that's the new sort of evolution of the Western. But that's not to say there weren't heroic Westerns and fun Westerns in this decade as well. So ultimately, a Western I would define as these themes of crime and of justice, usually set during this time period, often of the second half of the 19th century in the United States usually, but can be in other places, and then has a sense of reflecting on the past while also sort of dealing with an impending future. But jumping into the honorable mentions, my first honorable mention is Ain't Them Body Saints. Now, this is a movie from director David Lowery, who I'm a massive fan of, and we're going to be talking about some of his movies later on in later episodes for sure, as we sort of get into different genres. But for me, I actually thought this would maybe break the list when I first saw it, but as I was trying to write about it in this episode, I decided that, well, I remember I liked the movie. I remember it gave me sort of these Badland vibes, but I didn't remember necessarily certain elements of it, or certain visual imagery wasn't sort of coming back to me. So I rewatched it again, and it was on the list at one point, but I moved it back here to the honorable mentions because on one point I didn't really remember the movie as much as I thought. Rewatching it again, I actually had forgotten a lot about it, so it didn't have as much of an imprint on me. And the second time I sort of understood why. That there are some brilliant elements in here. The score is really terrific. This sort of Terrence Malick montage type of sequence filmmaking is something I totally relate to and totally connect to. And I think when done right in, say, a Terrence Malick film or parts of something like Arrival or something, it can have this alluring, enchanting, kind of engaging quality that transcends the film, the medium of film. It's the perfect utilization of that. And this has a lot of those moments, which is really great. And then it also has great performances. And Rooney Mara and Casey Affleck and Keith Carradine in particular. It's just a real standout for me. But the problem is just it keeps on going, and it doesn't necessarily maybe say anything about that. It just has these sequences, and once in a while they sort of, if not strung together properly, seem nonsensical and sometimes confusing. And then as it keeps on going on and on and on, I sort of lose my care and my interest that they're interesting with these themes, but they're not really trying to answer them or bring multiple sides. Or it just seems like sort of sometimes a slideshow of images that are beautiful and a great score and beautiful performances, but they don't come together and coalesce into sort of a complete vision, nor something that can keep and engage you within the entire film and lull you into that trance. It lulls you into a trance, and then you sort of get out of it, and then you're sort of a little bit confused as to why this is still continuing. I think partially maybe a direction issue, but because I'm such a big fan of David Lowery's, and because I'm a big fan of parts of this movie, and I just don't think it totally comes together in a great way. I think he succeeds later on, especially with his focus of a Pete's Dragon or the old man, the gun. Even Ghost Story, which is sort of nonsensical, but it also has a singular point and vision, which this I sort of feel lacks. But that's the reason why it's not on the list. It still has some moments, and it's a few parts away from a real masterpiece. My next honorable mention is Lucky. This is Harry Dean Stanton's second last performance, done at the age of 91. And it's a movie about a cowboy-like figure who is just living his day-to-day life in his older age. He has no family, he has no children, and we just see him in his sort of monotonous day-to-day life, going to bars, going to diners. And so on one hand, it's a very intimate, small, sort of routine-esque film about this older cowboy man, we'll say. But it's also confronting some of life's most existential questions. Now, knocking on death's door, Lucky is confronting a lot of these issues of what's going to happen to him, because he's not sick. He has a relatively clear mind. He's just going to eventually die based on his age. That few people make it to this age, and a fall could be just as devastating to him as a car accident. But the film is actually not this pretentious examination of what the meaning of life is, it's actually quite honest and endearing, and really comes at it from an earnest place. And I think a lot of that has to do with Harry Dean Stanton. He is, especially now, he's unfortunately passed away, but in his older age, even more so, we see a man who has had years on him. That he's always seemed like, even something like Paris, Texas, like he saw something, or he experienced something that we can't even imagine, and it's all within him, but he's not going to let us show it. But he's clearly broken, and he's gone through a life. So with this character of Lucky, we see when he actually tries to attempt to understand some of these questions, or has these dialogues with his friends, or trying to understand what's next for him, or what he can do during his right day to help his future. They're all come from these earnest and honest places, because Harry Dean Stanton, or the character of Lucky, has earned it. You can tell that this guy has lived a life and has seen things, and he has sort of earned this time to reflect. And that's what the movie is great about. It's taking these small moments, but then looking at it and just still taking, small character and just a small way, a very human story of people just living their lives, but then trying to explore some of these larger questions. I think you can also view it, of course, that many critics have before, as a career reflection of Harry Dean Stanton himself, and I think that works on one hand, but I think that's really undercutting the character of Lucky, who is honestly has his little joys and his little pleasures, and is honestly trying to get an answer to this lifelong question that every human has asked themselves. But also, he can be an asshole about it. He can be sort of flawed about it, that he's not just sort of this guy that everyone loves, Lucky, that he can be sort of a prick sometimes, but he's coming at it from, trying to a true place and from his experiences. So it's a small movie, enhanced so much by the great performance by Harry Dean Stanton, but really one that makes you think and just sort of moves in this sort of real quiet way. And I think it's kind of like a neo-Western, because he's very much a cowboy figure who has lived a life and is living in sort of like a small town again, and has a lot of those sort of similar Western vibes of looking back on the past with an impending future, except this impending future, of course, is his death. Then we have The Nightingale from director Jennifer Kent, who also, this is her follow-up to The Babadook, about an Irish convict living in Australia who is going on a revenge mission to kill a British officer who murdered her family. She teams up with the help of an Aboriginal, and they sort of have this unique relationship. And the film is actually kind of a unique element of where Westerns are very much male-dominated, and about male sort of mystery and the sort of cowboy figure of going to the nobleness and the earnestness, and sort of keeping these emotions down for the sake of everyone else's, and taking that sort of sacrificial, we'll say, bearing of seeing these terrible things for the the grace of the innocent, of the women and the children of that time. But this film actually is about female rage, something that we don't see too often, that this woman is so angry and she has lost everything. So in one part she's struggling with grief, which is a theme very prevalent in Jennifer Kent's last movie, The Babadook, but she's also incredibly angry, and rightfully so. And she has this relationship with this Aboriginal tracker who helps her get through the forest, where it could have easily sort of devolved into we're in different races, but we like each other, buddy cop, kind of, we come together in the end. But it's really not that they really confront these issues of this race divide, and how the Australians, came in and really took over their land, and how they're all, Australia was built on a bunch of convicts, the British sending over the criminals here to Australia. And they talk about that sort of the divide, and they don't like each other, and they don't really resolve that. The film also sort of goes into these psychedelic type places, because once that rage, almost fire, can only burn and last so long, then you sort of have to confront these elements of grief and what she's lost. It's a very internal type of movie, and it's a psychedelic movie in terms of you're lost in the forest at one point, but it's an interesting sort of fascination and element to look at female rage. It's a relatively simple revenge story, but the way they take it is by seeing this female perspective, also making it a little bit more psychedelic and a little bit more survivalist, that we maybe don't see in the sort of flat westerns. We now see the tall trees and going through that element. So it's a unique movie. It's a brutal movie. It's a movie that people tell you it's a hard watch, and it is a hard watch, but it's still incredibly crafted, and if it's an interesting story, an interesting perspective that maybe you haven't seen before, I recommend you check this one out. The next honorable mention is The Rover, which is a film from Australia, and the Australian Western, which is, Nightingale, is also an Australian production, and we saw a lot of Australian movies in this decade, and particularly, I guess, in the early 2000s, or the late 2000s, I'd say, mid to late 2000s, we really saw the boom of the Australian Western with the movie like, say, The Proposition. And we had Australian Western types with exploitation movies in the 70s, but I think really now is when we're starting to get great Australian directors and filmmakers, particularly coming out of the Australian Western genre. But The Rover, where most Westerns are set before civilized society is about to come in, it's always that impending rules and laws and society that's going to come and destroy the lawless way of life. If that's the impending civilized society, The Rover, I think, is the just after the civilized society has fallen. That this is a post-apocalyptic film, but it's not too sci-fi, not too distant. People still remember the old world. There's still cars and things like that. But society is falling. It's disappearing, and rules and these social sort of norms have long gone. And that this is sort of now a world that's going down the drain with no hope in sight. The movie's about this man played by Guy Pearce, who gets his car stolen, and it's his attempt to get his car back by any means possible, and find the man who took it and get his car back. That's all he wants. And the similarities to something like a John Wick have been made clear and obvious as this sort of silent killer man on a mission, and Guy Pearce really does well with that. But it's not John Wick in sort of the action, the excitement. This is a slower film. It's a Western. The horse is now replaced by the car. But it's interesting just to see the world and the sort of rules and evolutions of it, but also the cynical, nihilistic, incredibly bleak approach that this movie takes. I think it's one of the most bleak movies I've ever seen. Robert Pattinson teams up with Guy Pearce and has played sort of this dim-witted kind of a character who is a very sort of, I guess, the beginning of the Robert Pattinson dominance until now he's into Batman and Tenet, and he's, a major movie star once again. But this was one part where people were like, oh yeah, he's a really great actor, and he's doing something different here. And he brings a little bit of life to it, but I think the film really is sort of taking an honest viewpoint of this world, of what's needed to survive in this world, of what you have to do to survive. And that sort of take this, disregard of morals, this cynical kind of approach, this kill people at any chance possible, destroy the rules, and no retribution is going to come your way, but this is how you survive. So I thought it was an interesting sort of interpretation of the Western, where the Western before was impending civilization, but now this is the end of civilization as we know it, into something a little bit more into that lawlessness and the type of person that survives, that would have survived back then, but now survives in this time and thrives in this time. Then my next pick is The Rider, which is from director Chloe Zhao, who is the upcoming director of MCU's The Eternals, which will be released one day. And this is very much not a big sci-fi epic that they're planning to do with The Eternals. It's a smaller film about Brady Blackburn, who is a rodeo performer and rides horses for the rodeo, and got into a terrible accident. And now we are in the movie to see his recovery, and he's sort of working on his recovery, but it's centered around the choice of, should he go back? He's got a sister who he's caring for. He's got a physical representation of his friend who got paralyzed from that, so from an accident of rodeo. So he's dealing with these elements that tell him to not do it. But then, of course, you see an internal struggle of himself of wanting to get back on the horse and wanting to continue it because he loves this. He loves it, and he has this passion of it. So it's like, what is the cost of your dreams? What if your dream, will it take you to your final end? Is that worth it? Or is, seeing the consequences of that potential choice, or having, a good relationship with your sister and helping her out, is that what's more important? And that sort of giving up your dreams for someone else or not. It's sort of a central question to the film, and a really fascinating question, but it's an intimate film, and it's a quiet film, and it weaponizes its patience and its quietness and its internal reflection. That's not a movie with a lot of dialogue. It's a movie with a lot of pondering and a lot of thinking, but that with that central question being so compelling, I think it works as such, and Chloe Zhao does a great job at making sure it's paced well enough and moves along well enough, and things are happening well enough where you're not totally sort of lost in terms of the internal struggle, that internal struggle is realized externally, not necessarily by dialogue, but at least communicated well enough to the viewer. And it succeeds in its ability to rely on the patience, to rely on the moments of quiet, to just make that sort of central question and moment of internalization stronger. Then my number 10 pick is Bone Tomahawk,
which we are about to receive. Ambush!
Now, with this Western genre in particular, I could have easily put The Rider here at number 10, or The Rover, or any of the honorable mentions, because they've just been moving up and down the list. But I went with Bone Tomahawk ultimately to make the list because it is more of that traditional Western about these four guys who embark on a mission to get back the kidnapped citizens of their town by these cannibalistic Native Americans. From director S. Craig Zahler, who I think is one of the most interesting upcoming directors in his ability to tackle pulp and violence and interesting political beliefs that we haven't seen in other movies in a very unique way. And I think this is his first movie that really brought him onto the scene, because I say pulp in the sense that, pulp being characters who are broadly drawn, who are maybe stereotypes with a very sort of clear narrative mission, but then what S. Craig Zahler does and what he's unique about is that he actually brings an element of, I guess we'll call it sophistication or elegance to the storytelling in terms of its real confrontation with themes and of these types of people. That there's these four characters and all the actors are great and all do an incredible job, but what's great about S. Craig Zahler in an almost Tarantino-esque kind of a way is his dialogue. Not that it's sort of funny and interesting, but it's very different than what these characters probably would have been like. They're much more intelligent than maybe I'm giving them credit for, but that they always have these sort of surefire viewpoints on their lives, and they're going to espout them, and they're going to say them, and they're going to say them proudly, even though they're contradictory and even though that causes internal strife. And just hearing these guys talk in the sort of desert, going to their mission about sort of rules of law and of life and their approach to how they see the world and what the world is actually like and what the person is actually like, it's just incredible to hear. Just love hearing Zahler's dialogue of that back and forth between the actors, and the actors really play with it, and particularly a standout for me being Richard Jenkins. I think he gives a transformative performance, and I think a lot of people use that term where they become a real life person that and they transform into someone else, or they put on a lot of makeup or a lot of weight, and that's what's seen as transformative. But Richard Jenkins here does none of that, yet his performance is transformative because he's unlike anything I've seen him in any of his other roles, and because he totally embodies this character. A character who is sometimes at a loss because his viewpoints and his world viewpoints are actually being challenged for the first time, yet Richard Jenkins imbues him with a sense of earnestness, a sense of reality and realism, that he's at one point sort of confronted with a sense of being challenged his viewpoints, but then also trying to understand his viewpoints and argue for them and understand his sort of and explain his maybe simple way of life. He brings a real empathetic touch to the movie that is much needed, which is often contrasted with the intense violence, which is of course another element of this type of genre that is always there. There's always the sense that these guys are living a hard life, that's rugged, that they often die, that they can be totally unconceivable by the way we live our lives, that is just a total different way of life, that you have almost no idea of what it's like. And Zahler definitely dials it up to 11. The violence is extreme and gory, and especially in the second half, it almost becomes body horror-esque because of the cannibalistic elements to the film, and some of the brutality of just that Western idea that if you're shot and you're bleeding, everything's hot and it's dry, and there's flies already on you before your body's even dead. And some of those elements of the gore and the violence and the realism that Soller brings to the story are evident and are clear here as well. And he tackles it in such a brutally kind of honest way, a realistic way that is disturbing even more so. So one hand, you have this brilliant, eloquent, kind of poetic dialogue, and then you also have this intense violence. So the comparisons to Tarantino, I'm sure, have been made, but it's unlike him, and Zoller actually develops a unique voice and a unique take at this genre. And Bo and Tomahawk, with incredible performances from the four main leads, brilliant writing and dialogue, and then also this simple story, but with violence and with intensity in a movie like something you've really never seen before. So Bo and Tomahawk, I felt, had to make the list. Then my number 9 pick is The Revenant.
Afraid to die anymore. I've done it already.
The story of Hugh Glass, a legendary mythical folklore type of figure in American history, most notably known for being a real-life person who survived a bear attack, was left by his men, and survived and came back. And while that story most likely is totally, maybe not totally fabricated, but elevated and mythicized and made a total legend, the film isn't interested in what the truth is. The film is interested in replicating the legend, replicating this story, this mythical type story of Hugh Glass, this American frontiersman, fur trapper, played by the great Leonardo DiCaprio. And I think the story takes this sort of part mythical, part grim, part spiritual story into a unique combination that I haven't really seen before. And I think it's very similar to the old The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance line, where it says, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend, in the sense that the myth is much more interesting and the better version of the true, instead of the true historical facts, because it gives men a sense of hope, or it gives us this idealized version that we know isn't real, but is much better to live with that instead of maybe the reality of the situation. And I think Alfonso Gianaritu, who's the director, takes, and that's the approach he takes to this film. Now, I think the legacy of the film is most notably known for being the movie that Leonardo DiCaprio won his first Oscar for at the long overdue Oscar. And, I would say it's not his best performance, and the Oscars very rarely give out the award to the performance, or the best performance of the actor. It's very much later on at another time, countless times in history. But that's not to say Leonardo DiCaprio is not fantastic in this, because he is. He's a large reason why I think the film succeeds, because especially in the second half, or really that sort of middle second act, we are only with him. It's only about survival. It's only about him with minimal dialogue, just trying to survive and run into problem after problem, and him solving it and getting over it. And it's a brutal film in the same way Nightingale is, and it's through these forests, and it's in the cold, and it actually is a great Western because it weaponizes the weather. And that the Western is also always seen as, it can't be a Western because it's hot. Westerns have to be hot, but this Western is not hot. It's actually the opposite. But I would argue that much makes it a Western, because even though it's weaponizing the cold, it's still weaponizing the nature. It's still weaponizing the elements around him. And of course, it's taken during this time. Of course, there's Native Americans, so it has a lot of these elements. And it's a survivalist tale. It's a real tale trying to understand what it would actually be like surviving in nature by yourself while you're injured, without any modern medical technology, and the sense of grit and determination that is needed to get through this. And Leonardo DiCaprio shows all the pain and the anger that he has as the film sort of transitions into the second half of being a revenge tale against Tom Hardy's character as the villain, because they left him out there and killed his son. There are some Terrence Malick as spiritual elements which work its way into the story and work well, where he sees these visions and his connection with nature is together. But there are often times where it's a bleak story. I mean, most of the time it's a bleak, it's hard, it's so difficult to get through, but there are still moments where there are incredible moments of action, like that very opening sort of one take, which is exciting and interesting. And then there's also these small moments that are carefully planned in place throughout the movie, like Hugh Glass, when he has the snow start to fall and he's with a fellow Native American and they start to sort of eat the snow. I also want to mention, of course, the great supporting cast. Tom Hardy is really fantastic in this, and Donald Gleason is the commander, and sort of their different viewpoints on what you need to do to survive is a classic Western theme. And of course, the Western is always seen with ruggedness, and this is a film that's very rugged, and that sort of male connection is strong here as well. I think the movie succeeds in one part because of Leo's performance and what he's able to do, but also because of the beauty that comes with the harshness and that sort of duality that occurs within this movie, and that's its a success to Alejandro Inarritu, who won the Oscar for this movie for Best Directing. I think maybe not my pick of the year, but definitely I would have nominated him because what he's able to do with the story. And yes, it was a hard shoot, and you can factor in those things, but I think at the end of the day, the end product is sort of well constructed and has those moments and succeeds in the end of not being more than just a typical revenge story, but having some of these other elements of spirituality and of nature and of the strength of the human spirit. Then my number 8 pick, very fitting here at number 8 because it is The Hateful Eight.
Now we're talking.
Maybe seen now as an underrated Tarantino movie because of its box office success, but wasn't a massive box office success like some of other Tarantino's movies, and didn't get the Oscar love like some of other Tarantino's other movies. But that being said, it's still a great Tarantino movie because of it's sort of a great combination of everything he does really well. And the main reason why I like his movies is particularly because of his dialogue. Because if you've seen any of Tarantino's movies, you know his unique, rhythmic, eloquent, very funny, based sort of monologue heavy, very play-like dialogue that he imbues onto the screen, and is totally unique and is totally Tarantino. So when we have a story like this, which is set almost entirely in a cabin, and there's not a lot of action or things to maybe progress the story along, the story in itself is a story. It's being told. It's a murder mystery. We're being told things or what's happening, or we're being shown things or seen things, and it's just a sort of a play-like element where these actors can go back and forth. I definitely like the second half of this movie more, as I think the first half takes a little bit while to rev up and to get into some of the interesting parts. Interesting also, though, that he divided up into a mini-series, which is on the US Netflix. I haven't seen that, unfortunately. I just see sort of I'm just reviewing this and talking about this, and made the list based on the full, whatever, 2 hour and 45-minute movie that I see in one chunk, so I have to sort of judge it based on that. But of course, they have the Tarantino dialogue, but then there's these great actors who imbue the Tarantino dialogue with so much life, and there are some actors that just do it better than others, and maybe the best of all time is Samuel L. Jackson, and I think that this is actually maybe his best performance since Pulp Fiction in 1994. He often goes on these Tarantino-esque monologues. He's a whip-smart kind of a guy. He has an interesting past, being a now bounty hunter from being a disgraced fighter of the Civil War. Now, collects bounties. And then, of course, he's black, so that's another element. This is just after the Civil War, very much talks about the South and the Confederacies, with another great actor, and my other favorite part of the movie, which is Walton Goggins, who plays Chris Mannix, and Samuel Jackson plays Major Warren, but Chris Mannix is a part of the South, part of the Confederacy, and doesn't really like black people, and thinks they should be slaves. I mean, that's sort of the element of the story, and that's sort of the internal conflict, that there is a clear and a vocal and a upfront kind of a discussion on race and just a pure dislike of one another. And they have sort of an interesting back and forth, and they're both smart in their own ways, and both very funny and interesting, and there's still many funny moments in this, but I think where other Westerns are very much interested in landscapes, what Tarantino does is more interested in this time period and confines that into a singular cabin. Yes, there's that sort of threat of the blizzard, but the blizzard is only a plot mechanic, essentially, to put these guys in the same room together. That it seems Tarantino seems to be much more interested in the people, this sort of murder mystery story, but also the types of morals that are at play, and they talk about justice and what it means to hang, and the sort of immoralities of the hangman, and the purity of the sheriff for, you know, the past, and how they're trying to reconcile with that now. Of course, there are some great violent moments, especially in the second half, and this may be Tarantino's most violent movie in that sense. As it sort of escalates, it has this very much kettle kind of a rise to the climax, and in its revelations and in its intrigue, Tarantino always keeps you engaged, like listening to a great story in a storybook in a cabin. You are always interested, you always want to know what's happening next, and you always love to hear that sort of monologues that Tarantino brings and the type of dialogue that he has. And then you're also interested in the story as well. It has some of the elements that make it a Western, of course, because of the time period and the theme that they're tackling head on, but it's also a fun, great murder mystery type Agatha Christie play almost. And even though it's an underrated Tarantino movie, it's still a Tarantino movie, and I think almost all of his movies are really fantastic, and this is still no doubt. So I had to put Hateful Eight at number 8, but for number 7, and the final movie we're going to be talking about in this episode, is Rango.
Ow! What was that for?
You're a stranger. Strangers don't last long here.
Now you may be thinking to yourself, what? An animated film? What's that doing here? Well, simply put it, Rango is a Western. It's an animated film, yes, but animation is not a genre, so animation won't have its own episode, and Rango is a Western. It's somewhat of a family film, but it's actually, I think, a little bit more for adults. It fits this category more than any other film, and it's a type of Western that we don't get too often, which is the fun adventure Western. For this decade, which has been so obsessed with keeping that tradition of the realist Western, of seeing what it's actually like to do all these things, which I like, and when well done, are really fantastic Westerns, but that doesn't mean we need to completely forget about the adventure, the heroic, the 50s kind of style of a Western, which we don't see too often today. Now, this is from director Gore Verbinski, who also did The Lone Ranger, which has some fun set pieces and has that sort of 50s kind of adventure Western style. And then he also did the Pirates movies, so we have, I think that's what the movie succeeds in Gore Verbinski's real understanding of an action and an adventure and of set pieces. And because Rango is an animated film, he is able to do so many great things with it and go beyond the realities of the physical world. And the film is actually unique in the sense that most animated films are voiced with a microphone in front of you, and the director may be giving you some notes, but you're in a booth by yourself. You're not interacting with any of the actors, and then they all sort of bring it together in the final product. But with Rango, they had a soundstage, and they were just somewhat dressed up and had the props, and they were acting out, and the actors were together, and they would talk, and they would act together and feed off their energy, and then the animators would use their performance as reference, and then also use their dialogue and the voice performances that they gave on set and put it into the film. So as a result, we get these incredibly lively voice actors and voice performances that rival some of the best of the decade with some of the Pixar films. I think that this, even though it's kind of weird to say, Johnny Depp, this is maybe one of his best performances, that he brings an incredible energy and a sense of life to this lizard played by Rango, who is a pet who's now entered into this gruesome Western type world with other lizard type and armadillo creatures and creatures that would be living in the desert. So he's one part a great protagonist because he is the outsider who is introduced into this world, and he has to sort of fake his way through everything. But he's also incredibly charming, incredibly earnest, and really funny and great to be around. And Johnny Depp brings a lot of that to the performance. And so Gore Verbinski is able to have these great action set pieces that rival, canyon sequences that rival Mad Max Fury Road, and have these awesome action kind of movies that we'd see from some of the 50s, but now with a modern day lens and, of course, that animation tool. But also, he has Gorvinsky, if you've seen his movies, they're very weird and they're very odd, and he brings some of these surrealist elements to them and psychedelic elements, just being in the desert, and strangeness, because Rango, it's a weird movie, definitely. It's not something that's totally down the middle family film. It has some of these weirder elements and doesn't shy away from some of the scariness of the situation, and I really appreciate that. So on one hand you have this weirdness and the psychedelic trippiness, but then you can also have these great action adventure sequences. It's an awesome blend. The animation, for being almost 10 years old now, looks fantastic. The lighting, Roger Deakins was a consultant on the film, so it really looks beautiful in terms of what a lizard would actually look like, but then transferred through like an animation lens. So the characters and the animations and the movements are, of course, are all exaggerated, but the world feels realistic and grounded, like we actually are in the wild, wild west. So yes, this is an animated film, but it's got some of the most Western elements in any of the films we've talked about on this list. Great adventure, great set pieces, a funny, charming protagonist, a totally great world, looks beautiful, has some stranger elements, not necessarily a totally family-friendly film. So seeing just an American animated film that's not just totally family is, of course, a fresher breath air. And I think this is just a total blast of a Western, and a movie that I can watch at any time. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know some of your favorite Westerns of the decade. I'd love to hear them. That's about it. Until next time, stay tuned.